Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at the Indonesian M95/51 carbine and short rifle. This is, I think, a fantastically interesting conversion program with roots in the Dutch KNIL, the Dutch East Indies Army, the Dutch colonization of the East Indies, Indonesian independence, the Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II, and then Indonesia's friendship and military aid with Australia immediately after it gained independence in 1949-1950. So, what we have here are two rifles that started off life as Dutch M95 rifles or carbines. Now, the Dutch Army and the Dutch East Indies Army were two substantially different organizations that had all of their own different sourcing and different procurement, different military units, but they both used fundamentally the same base rifle, and that was the M95 Mannlicher. It was a en-bloc clip-fed rifle. It was chambered for the 6.5 by 50 millimeter Dutch Mannlicher cartridge, which is a small bore but rimmed cartridge, which will be very important a little bit later on. And the Dutch made like just a whole smorgasbord of different versions of the M95 rifle and carbine. I actually have a previous video on a handful of the different carbine variations, but some of these went to the Dutch East Indies in Indonesia for use by the KNIL. Now, when World War II starts to loom and when it becomes clear that the Japanese imperial military is a significant threat to the Dutch East Indies Army, the Dutch East Indies Army was really in trouble. They did not have like the big industrial infrastructure support back home that some of the other colonies did. They started having like serious issues with small arms. What do we do for armament procurement? One of the things they did was go to the United States. They actually bought Johnson rifles and light machine guns from the US, and most of those were not finished in time, and most of them did not get to the Dutch East Indies. They also started talking to Australia about some coordination and acquiring .303 caliber ammunition from the Australians. And in August of 1941, shortly before the islands are invaded by the Japanese, the Dutch KNIL actually sends off 3,775 Dutch Mannlicher rifles and carbines to Australia to be converted to .303 because, I said this would be important, the case head on .303 British is almost identical to the case head on 6.5 Dutch Mannlicher, to the point that both cartridges will work quite effectively interchangeably in Dutch Mannlicher clips, which means if you want to rebarrel or you want to convert a Dutch M95 Mannlicher to .303, it requires a new barrel, but it doesn't require any changes to the feed system. That makes it a feasible, practical adaptation to do. And in fact, 3,775 of these rifles arrived in September of 1941 at Paddington Workshop in Australia. They were duly converted to .303. They were shipped back. There are a lot of stories that the ship returning them to Indonesia was sunk by the Japanese. It was not. In fact, it did arrive. And in fact, in the 1950 KNIL inventory, there are almost 1,500 of those rifles still listed as available and in inventory. They saw a hard life through the Japanese invasion, the Japanese occupation of the islands, but they were there and they did survive. Some of them did survive after the war. Now, let's fast forward to 1945. Japan is defeated. World War II is over. There will then be a 4-year independence struggle in Indonesia. The Netherlands want to reestablish colonial rule over Indonesia. The Indonesians don't really want that to happen. There's a bunch of fighting that's way too complex for this video, but ultimately, in 1949, the Indonesians win their independence, and one of the first countries to officially recognize them is Australia. They continue to have good relationships with Australia. Now, 1950, the new Indonesian Republic has to come up with some sort of military armaments program. They need something. They have a whole bizarre mishmash of guns. They have British stuff. The first thing they do is adopt the SMLE as their standard infantry rifle, and they get a bunch of them from the British, but they have a lot of Dutch Mannlichers lying around. They have a lot of Arisakas lying around. There have been some programs converting bayonets and rifles, all sorts of different directions. The Japanese captured Dutch Mannlichers and used them. The Japanese converted some Dutch Mannlichers to 7.7 Japanese or 6.5 Japanese. Mannlichers were converted to use Arisaka bayonets, like a lot of weird stuff going on. The Indonesians start standardizing. They accept the SMLE, short magazine Lee Enfield in .303 as their standard infantry rifle. That's a rifle that's being manufactured in Lithgow in Australia, which they're able to acquire. They get some surplus stuff from the United States. In fact, in 1950, 1951, they start ordering FN-49 rifles from FN, brand new, like top-of-the-line, semi-auto, excellent battle rifles. Those are in 30-06 because they're not available in .303. But they have an issue of, okay, we've got military stuff, like we're working on the military stuff, but we have a lot of islands. Indonesia is a very spread out conglomeration of islands. Those have a lot of rural police forces who need some sort of small arm, and it would sure make things simpler if all of their ammunition was standardized. So what do we do about it? Well, some of the Australian advisors who are now working with the Indonesian military, along with some of the Indonesian military engineers and generals, they think about this program back in 1941 where they converted Dutch rifles to .303 with the help of the Australians, and they agree that this is a program that they can do once again to provide a standard cartridge firearm for the many disparate rural police agencies throughout the islands of the new Indonesian Republic. So this work is primarily done at an arsenal called PSM, which is essentially the weapons and munitions factory. This is an arsenal that has existed in a place called Baodang since the 1890s, when the Dutch created it as an artillery workshop, the Winkel Artillery Construction Workshop. And it went through a whole bunch of changes. It was used by the Dutch. When the Japanese invaded, the Japanese took it over and used it as a weapons maintenance and repair facility on their own. Then the Dutch took it back after 1945 and used it. Then the Dutch handed it over to the Indonesians in 1949 or 1950. It became known as PSM. And in 1950, 12 engineers or techs from PSM traveled to Australia with 800 barrels from Dutch Mannlicher rifles and carbines and a plan to rebore them to .303 caliber. They weren't going to replace them with new production barrels. That's expensive. They were going to take the existing 6.5mm barrels and bore them out with new rifling to .303 caliber. So they go to Lithgow, where they set up all this work. They convert 800 of these barrels in Lithgow with Australian assistance. The program is very successful. They come back to Indonesia, to PSM specifically. They actually bring with them 9 more Australian advisors to help set up the tooling. They have some loaned tooling from Lithgow as well. They get this program set up, and in 1951, they start production of the carbine, at PSM. So let's take a closer look at it because, well, it wasn't just a .303 rebarreling. They really built that carbine very specifically inspired by the British No. 5 quote-unquote jungle carbine, which makes sense. This was designed for fighting in places like Indonesia. So of course the Indonesians are going to copy it, but they're going to do it a little bit differently and in some ways a little bit better. All right, let's start with the carbine version. These things are really short and handy. Barrel is 19 inches. Let's start at the front with the most distinctive element here, which is this rather big chunky muzzle brake. This was directly inspired by the US cuts compensator. We actually know that from some factory documents that were recovered fairly recently that actually show a catalog picture of a cuts compensator with a bunch of markups on it, showing it extended back and given elements to mount a bayonet. Now there are like 5 or more different variations on this muzzle brake. This one, of course, has these holes. There are also several different varieties with slots in them, like the cuts compensator, and presumably they tried out a bunch of different designs to see what would work best. And I have no actual data on what did work best, but there are a bunch of different versions out there. This is also, of course, set up to use a bayonet, and one of the biggest points of contention or question online with collectors of these guns is, what bayonet does it fit? Because this does not fit it doesn't fit Dutch bayonets, it doesn't fit Arisaka bayonets, It doesn't fit Enfield bayonets. It, in fact, doesn't fit any bayonet that I have ever found. I saw some suggestion that maybe it was Tokarev, SVT-40 Tokarev bayonets, because the Soviets gave some assistance to the Indonesians at one point, but that doesn't fit either. Fundamentally, the biggest problem is the lug down here is just wider than most others, and nothing I've ever tried fits on there. So while I can't say for sure, this leads me to believe that the bayonet used for these carbines was something that was locally modified. Whether it was an Arisaka or an Enfield or a Dutch bayonet, I don't know, but I think the plan was to modify something to fit this design. I don't know of anyone who's ever found one of these bayonets, so perhaps they were never actually made. There certainly have been comparable periods in firearms development where someone will come up with an idea like this, and then for whatever reason they end up deciding that the accessory just isn't worth the time or doesn't work out. So who knows, maybe someday we will find an Indonesian 95-51 carbine bayonet that fits, but for the time being, I'm pretty confident saying that these things are customized by the Indonesians and essentially do not exist on the collector's market today. All right, now the sights. We have a gigantic barleycorn front sight, and that pairs with the original style of Dutch Mannlicher rear sight. To adjust this for range, all you have to do is squeeze these together, lift them up to whatever position, whatever range you want to use, like so. Pretty easy. The Indonesians added this little notch to the finger grooves in the rifles and the short carbines because what they have done is add a snap-on handguard. There we go. So this is just held on by spring sheet metal clips there. All right, now let's take a look at the markings here. The most distinctive one is this 5-pointed star with some squiggly stuff in the middle. That squiggly is actually, those are the letters PSM for the factory that did the conversions. Underneath the handguards on the barrels that are converted at PSM, you will find a second stamping of that star. That just indicates that they are Indonesian converted. The original 800 barrels done in Australia do not have that mark. We then have Cal 7.7. That's done because 303 British, this guy, in metric terms is 77 by 56 millimeters, and that's how the Indonesians referred to it. We then have a serial number and a date here. So serial numbers all have an A prefix, and that A is for Australian, recognizes the Australian technical assistance in doing the project. And then the serial numbers started at 1 and went up to 9,094. Production date alongside, most of these that you find will be dated 52 or 53. So the very first guns, about 100 guns were made in 1951. But then you get up to about 3,000 by the end of 1952. I don't have an exact number. The highest one that I personally have seen pictures of is 2319, which is a 1952 dated gun. The lowest 1953 that I have seen myself is 3130. So somewhere in that range, was when you cross over from 1952 to 1953. The vast majority of them were then made in 1953 up to number 8989, and then only about another 100 guns made in 1954. If we look at the left side of the receiver, we'll see the original Dutch production markings, and these can be either Steyr or Hembroek. Steyr, of course, in Austria was the company that originally made M95s for the Dutch government. Hembroek was the Dutch factory that started building them a little bit later on. So this was originally a 1921 production Dutch carbine. There are a couple of additional serial numbers here. The bolt handle is serialized and matching on this one. And the barrel band is also serialized and on this one matching. The trigger guard and magazine well is serialized and matching. And lastly, the butt plate is serialized and matching here. And that brings us to another interesting point. About 2/3 of these 95-51 carbines have just a standard flat steel butt plate on them. However, the Indonesians did decide to copy the rubber butt pad from the British jungle carbines. So this is a number 5 Enfield. You can see it's got this metal cup butt plate with a rubber pad on it that in theory serves to soften the recoil a bit, and it also gives you a little bit of a stickier surface so that the carbine doesn't slide out of your shoulder when you're using it. The Indonesians copied this pretty effectively. They didn't put a sling bar on it like the British did, but they also, on most of them, went with a serrated rubber butt pad. Now, these butt pads are in virtually always terrible condition. The rubber has deteriorated over the years. They were often in racks sitting on the butts, which compressed the butt pads. You can see this is one of the better ones, actually, that I've seen, but that's, you know, kind of what you're going to find with them. Now, we know from factory records that a grand total of 2,970 of these carbines got those rubber butt plates. The other version of this gun, the 95-51 short rifle, however, all of those, or virtually all of them, will have that rubber butt plate. So these are very easily distinguishable. They do not have muzzle brakes at the front. They have a much longer barrel. These have 26-inch barrels, and they also do not have the original Dutch rear sights. They have a two-position flip sight. So this is calibrated for 300 and 600 meters, and it just flips back and forth like that. But we fundamentally have the same style of clip-on handguard. You can see they've made cuts here in the finger grooves so that you have a place to grab this handguard and lift it off. There we go. And once again, we have little sheet metal clips to hold the handguard in place. And you can actually see a fair amount of work put into this conversion. So they've filled in some old empty slots in the stock there. We have the last 3 digits of the serial number stamped into the stock itself. And then our barrel and receiver markings are a little bit different. So once again, we have some markings under the handguard. We have that PSM Indonesian property star. We have a production date of 1954. The short rifles were made in 1954 and 1955, although the significant majority of them were done in 54. They have a slightly different style of serial number. We have a leading 4, which I assumed to be a year digit, but apparently all of them, including the 1955 production ones, do have that leading 4. And then we have 2 zeros and a 4-digit serial number. These went up to 4,905. The top of the receiver has its original Dutch markings scrubbed off, and it now just has a serial number. And the other markings have been relegated to the side of the receiver. So where this originally would have had its Steyr or Hembrugg markings, they've cut a scallop down in the receiver and re-stamped them with the Indonesian property star, the caliber 77 marking, and the production date. As with the carbines, we have the serial number marked in a couple of other places. So we have the full number here on the bolt handle. We have the last 3 digits on the nose cap and the last 3 digits on the side of the butt plate. I should point out that these do not have the same sort of strange bayonet attachment as the carbines. These retain their original Dutch nose caps, and the barrels have been turned down to the same bore diameter, the same muzzle diameter as the Dutch long rifles. So these will actually take standard Dutch rifle bayonets. You will occasionally see guns like this that were modified to take Japanese Type 30 Arisaka bayonets. Those are distinctive because they will have an additional bayonet lug basically welded onto the bottom here, extending a bit lower because the Arisaka bayonet was more offset from its lug than the Dutch M95 bayonet. But standard M95-51 short rifles will use standard Dutch bayonets. To show you the ammunition, this is standard 6.5 Dutch in a 6.5 Dutch clip. 303 British fits just perfectly in the same clips. Now, it's important to remember here that these are not brand new barrels in the conversion guns. They are original 6.5 barrels that have just been bored out. So they drilled out the bores and opened them up and re-rifled them for 303 British. And then for the chambers, they ran 303 reamers into the chambers of what were originally 6.5 Dutch barrels. And there are a couple spaces in there because these shoulders are not exactly the same. You will actually end up with a slight double shoulder in fired cases when you shoot 303 in these converted guns. It's not a safety hazard. It's just sort of an artifact of the conversion process. I don't have an example here to show you, but if you go onto the various forums online, you can find pictures of a bunch of people's fired cases from these rifles. So that's the reason, is just the difference in diameters of the neck of the original cartridges. So there you go. There are the two different versions of Dutch M95 51, the carbine and the short rifle. I think it's important to point out that while a lot of these guns in the United States are in really quite poor condition today, that wasn't original. When these were originally made, they were very well done conversions. They were safe. The 303 British and the 6.5 Dutch cartridges have similar chamber pressures. Like this was a safe conversion. It was done with experienced technical aid from the Lithgow arsenal. And they're frankly a really neat, to me, an interesting piece of second line firearms history from a corner of the world that we don't normally see a lot of surplus out of. Production finalizes in 1955 with the last of these guns being made fairly early in the year, and they go into service. They're used by police forces effectively. It's a little unclear to me exactly why there are two different versions of this. The short rifle, this guy, I see suggestions that they were used as military training rifles, which certainly would make sense. They're available. It was a relatively cheap conversion process, and training rifles are going to get the bejesus beaten out of them by subsequent classes of trainees. So why not use a second line conversion gun to get some of that wear and tear out of the way before you start burning up brand new guns that are expensive and a lot more valuable? At any rate, they're used until 1961, when they're no longer needed. I guess Indonesia had enough other modern firearms that these things are like, we can get rid of these now. And they're put up on the market as surplus, and they're imported into the United States by a company called InterArms, Sam Cummings, put up for sale in 1962. And you can recognize those because they don't have any importation marks on them, because they didn't need to. Import marking was only required starting in 1968. So both of these actually are InterArms 1960s imports, and they're fairly nice condition guns because they hadn't had that much time to rot away in Indonesian jungle storehouses. Well, in the 1970s, they actually discover a second batch of these that had been held by a rebel group up in North Sumatra. And those are additionally kind of rounded up and put on the market and sold as surplus. And those come into the United States through a company called Odin. A lot of them were sold by Springfield Sporters. It's sort of the second tranche of Indonesian M95 303 conversions, or M95/51 carbines and short rifles. Those are the ones that you will find. They're typically in worse condition because they spent a lot more time in Indonesia, and they have the Indonesian 5-pointed star markings ground off of them as one of the conditions that the government put on the export sale at that point. So we actually have a fair number of these guns in the United States right now, which is, I think, really pretty cool. Some of them are in better condition than others, but they're a neat and poorly documented and not very well-known collectible that really, like, there aren't a whole lot of people out there deliberately interested in collecting Indonesian firearms or Dutch Mannlichers, and so these tend to be relatively quite affordable guns. Anyway, I would like to give a big thanks to George Lehman. He wrote a fantastic article on these guns, which provided the majority of the data that I have for them, based on some factory records that were only found relatively recently. I think in the PSM facility, which I believe is now being run by Pindad, the Indonesian arms manufacturer. Anyway, they found some old records with a tremendous trove of data in them, and that's what allowed this video to happen. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.